The last stand. It's something that plays a special role in the human psyche, particularly when it comes to literature and media. There is something particular about people knowing there is no hope for them anymore, doing their best so that others may have a chance. Of course, when we talk about last stands, we instantly think of battles from antiquity, things like Thermopylae, or in a more modern sense, Mariupol in Ukraine. But what if I told you in those months after Pearl Harbor, that a small navy fought its own last stand against a monster so large it knew it had absolutely zero hope in hell of a victory, but it did it anyway, to buy time, to simply try because they had to do it. I am of course talking about the last stand of the Tinpot Navy, the Royal Australian Navy, that fought and punched above its weight in those dark days, knowing full well that it could not stop the Imperial Japanese Navy. This year, the 21st of March, was actually commemorated by an immense fleet review into Sydney Harbour to celebrate the 125th anniversary of the Royal Australian Navy. So I hope you enjoy these stories, and have a look at other videos on this topic on my channel if you do enjoy them.
That means clearly and specifically that every human being in this country is now, whether he or she likes it, at the service of the government to work in the defence of Australia.
Our stories today begin with the tale of HMAS Yarra, a small Grimsby-class sloop of the Royal Australian Navy named for the Yarra River in the state of Victoria. Yarra was one of the 4 Australian sisters of the larger Grimsby-class sloop, and this one was built at the Cockatoo Island dockyard in Sydney. She was laid down on the 24th of May 1934 and launched on the 28th of March 1935, before being formally commissioned into the Navy on the 21st of January 1936. The ship's motto was Hunt and Strike, and her job was simple: escort merchants, patrol, and kill submarines. Her displacement was only 1,000 tons at standard load, and with a length of about 81.5 metres and a beam of 11, she wasn't large at all. She was powered by 2 Admiralty 3-drum boilers and Parsons turbines, delivering just 2,000 horsepower to 2 shafts. She could achieve the top speed of just 16.5 knots, and her armament, 3 quick-firing 4-inch anti-aircraft guns, and some light weapons for close-in air defence. The ship's crew was 135 in peacetime and 160 in wartime, and as I've just explained, she wasn't large, she wasn't powerful, but she was vital, particularly when considering the war to come and the fact she belonged to an island nation. When World War II finally broke out in 1939, Yarra was initially attached to the 20th Minesweeping Flotilla, conducting patrols in Australian waters. However, by August 1940, Yarra sailed from Fremantle bound for the East Indies Station, where she would be based in Aden. It was here where her primary mission became convoy escort in the Red Sea. On October 20th, 1940, she was part of the escort for Allied convoy BN-7, which came under attack from a group of Italian destroyers. Yarra and her fellow escorts successfully drove off the attackers and protected the convoy. During this action, Italian forces actually fired torpedoes at Yarra, but they were able to be evaded. In March to April 1941, Yarra underwent a refit in Bombay, and shortly afterwards she joined the escort of the convoy BP-7 from Karachi to Basra in the Persian Gulf. The deteriorating situation in Iraq drew Yarra into the Anglo-Iraqi War, where she helped secure key ports and oil facilities. Later that year, she supported the Anglo-Soviet invasion of Iran, during which she engaged and sank the Iranian sloop Baba, and captured a pair of Iranian gunboats, as well as the Italian vessel Hilda. In 1941, Yarra would be briefly transferred to the Mediterranean, where she participated in the Tobruk ferry service, escorting ships with supplies bound for the besieged Australian, British and other Allied troops in North Africa in the port of Tobruk. With the entry of Japan in the war in 1941, though, Australia began to call its forces home, and Yarra got the orders to return. She departed Alexandria on the 9th of December 1941, and reached Java on the 11th of January 1942. There she resumed convoy escort duties in increasingly dangerous waters as the Japanese forces advanced rapidly down the Malay Peninsula and through the Dutch East Indies. On the 5th of February 1942, Yarra escorted a convoy to Singapore. This was actually the last convoy to reach the city before its eventual fall to Japanese forces. During this mission, Japanese aircraft attacked the convoy, and Yarra shot down at least 1 aircraft and damaged others, before rescuing 1,800 soldiers from the burning troopship SS Empress of Asia. The following day, Yarra left the convoy near Palembang to tow the disabled destroyer HMAS Vendetta, successfully bringing her and other vessels to Tanjung Priok. March would prove to be tragic for the Royal Australian Navy. losing one of its 3 modern light cruisers HMAS Perth in the Sunda Strait earlier that month. As Allied forces withdrew, Yarra was tasked with escorting the small convoy, including the depot ship Anne King, the tanker Francoll, and the minesweeper MMS 51 from Tajallup towards Fremantle in Western Australia. One last voyage and she would be home. But it was not to be. On the 4th of March 1942, just 3 days after the horrific loss of HMAS Perth, and roughly 500 kilometres south of Java, the small convoy encountered a powerful Japanese surface force consisting of the heavy cruisers Otago, Takao, and Maya, supported by 4 destroyers. Even a single destroyer from this squadron outgunned the little Yarra in such a way that it wasn't even funny. But, and here was the but, surrender was not in the Yarra's motto. In an extraordinary act of bravery, Lieutenant Commander Robert William Rankin, Yarra's commanding officer, made best speed and ordered his men to stations, and he laid down a smokescreen and ordered the convoy to scatter. He then placed the Yarra between the enemy fleet and the merchant ships and gave the order to fire. Yarra, her guns as useless as they were and most likely completely out of range and impossible to hit anything, continued to engage the enemy despite overwhelming odds, buying as much time as possible to give the merchants even the slightest possible chance. It was all over pretty quickly though. The cruiser's heavy guns soon sank the Allied vessels, and Yarra herself was set ablaze and sunk shortly after 8 o'clock. The Japanese vessels then made themselves scarce, and just 34 survivors were taken into the lifeboats from the Yarra. But after several days at sea, only 13 were still left alive when they were rescued, on the 9th of March 1942, by the Dutch submarine K-11. Lieutenant Commander Rankin was not amongst the men rescued. He was last seen on his bridge, giving orders when struck by an 8-inch shell. The Yarra, small as she was, could have surrendered. There would have been no shame in it whatsoever. But she didn't. She did her duty, and although it was for nothing, she still tried. She still stood up when it was more than okay to sit down. Today, Rankin is honoured in the Royal Australian Navy with the attack submarine HMAS Rankin named in his honour, and there have been subsequent HMAS Yarras. This next one here, the loss of the Canberra. This one's particularly poignant to me because after all, I do live in Canberra. It's my home city, and I've seen the memorial to this ship many, many times when I've gone for a walk near the lake in the centre of the town. And so, here's the story. After the scuttling of the battlecruiser HMAS Australia at the end of the First World War, this was in compliance with the Washington Naval Treaty, Australia was left with only 3 old pre-war light cruisers for defence and a handful of smaller vessels. With treaties in place, the Royal Australian Navy decided to modernise its force with a pair of heavy cruisers to fill the void. They were to be named HMAS Australia, after the nation of course, and HMAS Canberra, after the nation's new capital city, which was a planned city being built between its 2 major cities of Sydney and Melbourne, as a design city from the ground up. Canberra was one of 7 Kent subclass county-class heavy cruisers designed and built under the restrictions of the Washington Naval Treaty. She was laid down on the 9th of September 1925 at John Brown and Company shipyard in Clydebank, Scotland. Canberra was launched on the 31st of May 1927 and commissioned on the 9th of July 1928. She was designed to combine heavy gun armament with good speed and range. No battleship or battlecruiser of course, but she displaced 10,000 tons as standard, and she had a maximum speed of 31.5 knots. Her main armament consisted of 8 8-inch 203mm guns in 4 twin turrets, supported by anti-aircraft guns, machine guns, torpedo tubes, and of course an aircraft catapult. After commissioning, Canberra sailed from Scotland and reached Sydney by early 1929, where she spent much of the next decade operating in Australian waters as a major unit of the Royal Australian Navy, alongside her sister and a small destroyer squadron. She would make multiple deployments overseas during this period too, including visits to New Zealand, New Caledonia, Fiji, and of course China. And she occasionally served as the flagship of the Navy when the HMAS Australia was unavailable. Canberra's peacetime career also included ceremonial duties and escort assignments during royal visits. When World War II broke out in 1939 though, Canberra was initially tasked with patrol and convoy duties around Australian waters. In early 1940, she escorted the first convoy carrying Australian and New Zealand troops to the Middle East, and later operated with other Australian and British warships to protect troop movements across the Indian Ocean after Italy entered the war. During this period, she also attempted to track down the German commerce raiders that had been sent to the Southern Hemisphere to wreak havoc on the Allied shipping routes. In late 1941 though, with the Japanese threat growing, Canberra's operational focus shifted to the Pacific region, and she made her way home to defend Australia. After Japan's entry into the war in December 1941, Canberra was increasingly involved in operations around New Guinea, Malaysia, and the Dutch East Indies, protecting convoys and contributing to the Allied naval presence in the region. In early 1942, she actually underwent a refit in Sydney, during which she became the first Australian warship to be fitted with radar. Canberra was also present in Sydney Harbour during the Japanese midget submarine attack in May to June 1942. By mid-1942 though, Canberra was assigned to Task Force 44, conducting offensive patrols and supporting amphibious operations. From July, she played a crucial role in Operation Watchtower, the initial landings on the Guadalcanal campaign, where she screened troop transports as part of the cruiser escort for the landings. On the afternoon of the 8th of August 1942, a Japanese task force under the command of Gunichi Mikawa, composed of 5 cruisers and a destroyer, made for the Allied landing force off Guadalcanal. The Australian Naval Commander of Task Force 44, Admiral Victor Crutchley, expecting a Japanese assault, had divided his ships in groups into positions around Savo Island. Crutchley himself had his flag in HMAS Australia, and he led the Southern Patrol Force, which included Canberra and the US heavy cruiser USS Chicago, along with the destroyers USS Patterson and USS Bagley. At 20:45, Crutchley was summoned to confer with Admiral Richmond K. Turner, the overall commander of the amphibious operation. When Australia departed, Chicago was technically the senior ship present, but Canberra, which had been following Australia in formation prior to Crutchley's departure, found herself leading the formation. Shortly after 1 o'clock, on the 9th of August, the sound of aircraft engines was heard overhead, and these were assumed to be Allied aircraft, but in reality, they were Japanese scouts. At 1:45, USS Patterson's radar detected the approaching Japanese forces, and a warning was transmitted, but it was simply too late. Almost simultaneously, the Japanese scout planes illuminated the Allied cruisers by dropping flares, silhouetting Canberra and Chicago against the night sky. As the engagement began, Canberra successfully avoided the initial spread of Japanese torpedoes. However, she was quickly caught under intense gunfire by the enemy cruisers. The first salvos were devastating. Several senior officers were killed and wounded, both engine rooms were knocked out. The bridge and a 4-inch gun platform were damaged, and flooding was forced in one of the 8-inch magazines to prevent catastrophic explosions. Within just 2 minutes, Canberra had been struck approximately 24 times, and the ship was left powerless and immobilized, listing to starboard, with serious internal fires and heavy casualties among her crew, and at least 1 torpedo explosion was reported during the attack, although none of the 19 torpedoes launched by the Japanese cruisers were officially recorded as hits. Some surviving crew members later believed a torpedo from Bagley may have inadvertently struck Canberra in the confusion in a blue-on-blue incident. Of her 819 officers and sailors, 84 were killed and over 100 wounded, but the thing is, although it was mere minutes, Canberra, due to the Royal Australian Navy's different policy on action stations to the United States Navy, bought time. Just enough time for the remainder of the fleet not to be ambushed and destroyed. Just minutes, but her fight, even though it was over in the blink of an eye, was crucial. In that time, Chicago was able to get to action stations, and the rest of the fleet was alerted, and it prevented the entire Japanese force from ambushing the Allied landing force. By 3:30 it was all over. The Japanese ships had retreated, and Patterson came alongside and told the Australian crew that Rear Admiral Turner was intending to take his ships and leave the area, and that if Canberra could not regain her mobility by 6:30, she was going to be scuttled. Patterson began taking off survivors, but at 4:30 she detected an approaching vessel. Moving to investigate, the destroyer was suddenly fired upon. Patterson returned fire before it became clear that the attacker was none other than USS Chicago, which had mistakenly identified Canberra as a Japanese ship. Once the error was realised, the firing ceased and Patterson resumed rescue operations assisted by USS Blue. The reality at this point was that Canberra remained afloat. Her crew had done their work, and she did not appear in immediate danger of sinking, but the damage control teams assessed her situation and concluded that her engines could not be repaired within the allotted time. Towing her to Tulagi for emergency repairs was deemed by the US commanders impractical, even though it was completely possible. Turner was convinced the Japanese were coming back, and he ordered the American destroyers to scuttle the Australian ship. Her loss occurred during what is to be known today as the Battle of Savo Island, one of the most severe Allied naval defeats of the Pacific War. In addition to Canberra, 3 US cruisers were sunk and a destroyer damaged in the battle, but the invasion fleet was safe. Even though it left, it was still safe. The loss of Canberra so soon after the loss of HMAS Sydney, HMAS Perth, and the Yarra, and a handful of other destroyers that also went down, was just another gut punch to the Royal Australian Navy. It did, however, mark the end of the Navy's last stand. Recognising the hell that the Navy had been through, the United Kingdom, desperate itself for ships, transferred the heavy cruiser HMS Shropshire, now the HMAS Shropshire, to a sister of Canberra, to Australia as a replacement for the vessel. The United States, meanwhile, would name, for the first time in its history, a major warship after a ship, and after a capital nonetheless, naming the new Baltimore-class heavy cruiser USS Canberra. Today, the ship has been commemorated multiple times. There's a monument in her namesake city that I referenced at the start, a guided missile frigate, an assault carrier, and more recently, an American littoral combat ship named USS Canberra in her honour. Although her fight was brief, and it wasn't by any means glorious, in fact it was a horrific defeat, that time, those few minutes, made all the difference. And because of that, the US invasion fleet was not caught off guard by that Japanese cruiser squadron. Canberra and those 3 American cruisers, they went down doing exactly what they were there to do. Protect the invasion. Protect the fight back. Our last story today will be about Teddy Sheean. He is someone who needs no introduction if you know anything about Australian naval history, but someone still vital and worth having his story told if you've never heard of him. Edward Teddy Sheean was born on the 28th of December 1923 in Lower Barrington in Tasmania, that tiny island off the bottom of Australia that many people don't really notice on a map. The youngest boy in a large family. Teddy would grow up near Latrobe and would spend his teenage years working as a farm labourer before, like so many other young men, enlisting in the Royal Australian Naval Reserve on the 21st of April 1941, not long after his 17th birthday. Sheean was just one of several siblings who would serve during the Second World War, with 4 brothers in the Australian Army and 1 already in the Navy. After initial training in Tasmania at the Flinders Naval Depot in Victoria, he was posted to Garden Island Naval Base in Sydney in May 1942, where he joined the newly commissioned corvette HMAS Armidale as an Oerlikon anti-aircraft gunloader. HMAS Armidale was a small Bathurst-class corvette engaged in convoy escort duties along Australia's northeastern and northern coastal waters, including missions in support of operations around New Guinea. These little ships, numbering 60 vessels in total, were, and there is no way to put this mildly, a monumental achievement for Australia. Built in Australia across the nation and comparable to the Flower-class corvette in the Northern Hemisphere, they filled a vital role, and they filled it well. Some would actually serve into the modern era, with HMAS Bendigo of all things ending up in the People's Liberation Army Navy. Yes, the Communist Chinese Navy until 1988. Armidale, though, would have a different path. In November 1942, she was ordered to Darwin, and then tasked with taking supplies and reinforcements to the Australian garrison and Allied troops in Timor, deep in the Japanese-controlled territories. On November 29th, Armidale departed for Botano on this dangerous mission in company with HMAS Castlemaine, a ship that actually survives to this day in Melbourne, Australia. Along the way, they came under frequent Japanese aircraft attack, delaying their arrival and forcing them to miss a scheduled rendezvous with a patrol vessel HMAS Kuru. On the 1st of December 1942, as Armidale and other ships approached Botano, they were assaulted by a force of around a dozen Japanese aircraft. Armidale was hit by 2 torpedoes and a bomb, and she began to sink rapidly. The order to abandon ship was given, and the crew members began to enter the water and launch the available rafts. Young Teddy Sheean was wounded by bullets in the chest and back during this phase of the engagement, and he made his way to abandoned ship when he noticed the Japanese aircraft turning around. The aircraft began to then strafe the men floating in the water, who were totally at their mercy. Teddy, who I must stress was still a boy and reportedly unable to or barely able to walk, freed the life raft he was working on, and then dragged himself to a 20mm anti-aircraft gun. The young man then strapped himself to the mount as blood poured from the wounds, and he fired. As Armidale rolled over and sank, he kept firing, even as water covered his head and his gun. He kept firing until he finally drowned. Men in the water reported seeing the trace of firing breaching the surface from his actions. Contemporary accounts credit him with shooting down at least 1 bomber and damaging another, before he finally succumbed to the water. Of the 149 men on Armidale, only 49 were eventually rescued in the days afterwards. In the immediate aftermath of his death, Sheean was posthumously mentioned in dispatches for his bravery and devotion to duty. However, many argue that his actions merited the Victoria Cross, Australia and the British Empire's highest award for valour, but this call largely fell by the wayside. In 1999, Teddy was actually honoured with the naming of the attack submarine HMAS Sheean, commissioned in his name, with its crest sporting the words "Fight On." Until the commissioning of HMAS Choules decades later, HMAS Sheean was the only warship in the Royal Australian Navy ever named for an enlisted man, and to this day, it is the only warship ever named in the service for an ordinary seaman and not a non-commissioned officer. After decades of advocacy by his family, fellow veterans, and historians and public supporters, Sheean's original award would be upgraded to the Victoria Cross for Australia in 2020. This honour was approved by Queen Elizabeth II and it was presented to his family, and now there is a display crediting him in the Hall of Valour at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, showing his Victoria Cross. There is also a display in the section on World War II at the memorial dedicated to the young man. Well, there you have it. 3 stories telling the last stand of the Royal Australian Navy in those few horrifying months after the attack on Pearl Harbor. I've specifically chosen defeats for a reason, because I said this in my videos on Anzac Day 2 years ago. It's easy to celebrate victories. It's much harder to remember defeats. I hope you've all enjoyed these stories today, and if you want more, let me know. I love telling the history of Australia, particularly its Navy and its history at sea. So if you want to learn more about Australia, by all means check the playlist that this will be attached to, and also I've done some work in our colonial history on the channel I co-host with Rex Zanger called The Lesser of Two Weevils. Like, comment, subscribe, and I'll catch you all next time. Links in the pinned comment.